right, so welcome everybody to this breakaway session, speaking to infrastructure in Africa and how we can see where this is going to go in the future, how the technology will change and what are the big trends, how do we help to bring this on and make it happen. I'm going to start off by just introducing everybody on the panel and giving them a chance to just give a short introduction to themselves and their businesses. So Craig, I'll start with you. If you can tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Winston, for that. I'm Craig Parker, a Research Director for Frost & Sullivan Africa. And I've been with Frost & Sullivan for just over 12 years now, working with projects mainly in Africa, but also in economic forecasting and consulting for the global organization. I've also been involved in heading up the mobility practice for Frost & Sullivan Africa for about 7 years now. So we've been dealing with a lot of things, in terms of mobility, infrastructure, policy across Africa. Frost & Sullivan is a strategy consulting and market intelligence company. We're obviously global. We've got our practice in Africa, and we do a lot of projects for the private and public sector. And we obviously work across multiple industries, that obviously range from ICT, manufacturing, chemicals, automotive, logistics, healthcare. So there's a lot of industry focus that we have.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Tim?
Yes, hi. So my name is Tim Jacques. So I'm the CEO of Motus Africa. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Motus. We have businesses and motor vehicle dealerships and distributorships throughout East Africa, and some other sort of transport-related businesses as well. We're quite familiar with what's happening on the ground in these countries. What are the constraints, what's happening, what's going on currently, and what are some of the opportunities out there relating to the transportation and logistics sector. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Edom from Yellow.
Hi everyone, my name is Edom Foley from the Uyilo e-mobility program. It's a national electric mobility program in South Africa, and it was initiated by the Technology Innovation Agency, which is an entity of the Department of Science and Innovation within South Africa. And our primary purpose is about enabling, facilitating, and mobilizing electric mobility in South Africa and establishing national and international and continental partnerships to help us enhance our projects and our initiatives and our strategic objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shantha?
Yeah, good morning. So my name's Shantha Bloom, and I'm the founder of a startup called Mobility for Africa. We've been working in Zimbabwe to try and solve the last mile mobility crisis that I would say affects many parts of rural Africa and also urban Africa. But we've taken on the rural challenge by trying to help address the social consequences that has in both getting goods to the market, getting people to access social services. And we've been testing out an e-tricycle using an off-grid fleet management system using battery swapping. I came from 30 years of working in the UN system in development, many of them in different parts of the continent, and basically decided to leave my day job and set up the startup because it seemed that we had not been able to solve the infrastructure deficit. Logistics is so critical to so many outcomes, not just economic development, but social. And so I thought, rather than just talk about the problem, it was an opportunity to try and solve it. So we've been really exploring the whole e-mobility sector, and we've also been working on the policy in Zimbabwe, helping the government to draft their e-mobility policy, which hopefully will be adopted soon.
Great, thank you very much. And Justin.
Hi everyone, I'm Justin Kitsia. I'm CEO of a company called GoMetro. I'm a civil engineer by background and working in transportation systems development for the last 15 years. I come from a road building background before realizing that we need more public transport than we do need roads, and have been working at the intersection of transport mobility data for the last decade. GoMetro has a few technology accolades. We launched the first customer app for PRASA with about 250,000 users using the app to get train times and then email their boss when they were late using the app. We've worked with minibus taxi, the minibus taxi sector in South Africa, in coming up with business value calculations for BRT projects, as well as reforming the industry. And we're now looking at how electric vehicles can have an impact on the minibus taxi sector, the bus sector, and commercial freight.
Great, thank you very much. And well, myself, my background is probably a little bit more in the theoretical side and in physics and things like that, but I spent most of my life on the systems side, working with developing various IT systems, and then pretty much the last 20 years, very much into the electric vehicle space. I've looked at developing of vehicles, I've worked with some of the manufacturers, and more extensively, we worked into the charging space, and again, in the systemizing and the management of those platform systems. So that's sort of been my major background up until now. I think transport across Africa it's such an interesting topic, and there's so many angles to this and so many drivers that are driving it. Certainly, I think every African country is looking and saying, how do we localize, how do we benefit locally within our own environments? But I think that it's quite important that we look at reaching a balance, because totally localizing is not the long-term solution. We've got to look at the collaboration and how we start to bring these things together and reaching the right sort of balance. So I'm hoping today that as we talk through some of these topics, that we can try to inform that balance to some extent. So looking on the ground how things are happening, but at the same time, strategically, how do we plan forward for Africa? Over the last few years, we've seen massive global influences that have really impacted the industry. I can name just a few. COVID, the Suez Canal obstruction that we had in the Suez Canal, that really impacted logistics across the world in one tiny little place. War, or let's call it the Russian war in Ukraine. And, so all of these things have got real big impacts, and especially, I think, on Africa. I think because we're at that level where we're very exposed to what's happening worldwide. So equally, on the other side of it, we're seeing new technologies that are opening up opportunities for us. Those technologies being the fourth industrial revolution, and which is really a collective term for technologies like 5G, access to information, self-driving vehicles, drone technology, electric transport, my personal favorite, and access to energy, or access to renewable energy more particularly. I think what we're seeing, we're in a time now where we're seeing a lot of energy availability, but in a distributed way. And I think that's going to open up the energy sector quite drastically. And whatever solution we're looking at going forward, we're going to have to involve that. So I'm going to put out a question, and I'd like each of you to give me how that applies in your business. And it might not be 100% applicable, but please look and see how the projects you work with, the people that you're involved in, let's have a look and get some understanding of that. So can you each tell us a little bit about, how you leverage operations, research, and projects in leveraging some of these new technologies, fourth industrial revolution, to coin the phrase. So how have you taken that to look at or understand how that's going to impact the operation and research of projects going forward? And I'd also like to hear very specifically about the projects that you see opening up this market that you're directly involved in or that you've supported. So I'm going to go through the same order each time. So Craig, you're always going to be first up. So
Sure, no worries. So in terms of the projects we work on, obviously as consulting, firm, we work with a number of private companies as well as, public sector. I think just to first mention is, the projects that we do in terms of logistics with it's either DFIs or private institutions. There's a lot of movement in that space in terms of, mergers, acquisitions, and so forth. And there's a lot of interest in South Africa, especially in terms of investment in new, distribution, especially when it comes to, your storage, your last mile, for instance. That's extremely important. And then, obviously, with that, we're seeing these technology factors that are creeping in to give the competitive advantage, because they obviously have major, cost advantages. And that plays heavily on what I particularly focus on is the business models, at play. So you've got your, the supply chain management aspect of that, which is extremely important when it comes to the new technologies that are, popping up, that are seriously increasing efficiencies within the business. And then also very importantly in Africa is the security aspect. Which makes a massive difference for that. So in terms of the new technologies, that's being heavily used in supply chain management, and that's integrating with the telematics companies and industries as well. Further afield, Africa, just sticking with the sort of logistics theme, is cold chain distribution. That is a massive interest and topic at the moment. In Africa, a lot of especially West Africa, the cold chain distribution is non-existent. So you've got, very minimal warehousing, reefer trucks, containers on the road, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of interest in that from your public finance institutions to drive this. And I think this is very important when it comes to Africa, is that it's the collaboration aspect of the private and the public, because it's somewhat daunting and sometimes doesn't make full economic sense for just one private company to go in and lay down a large amount of infrastructure. I'm not going to go too much into the other industries, but in terms of the distribution and value chains for the industries that we work with, for instance, chemicals, petrochemicals, healthcare, and so forth. So there's a lot of aspects there, but I mean, it's all dependent on infrastructure. That I think I'll end off with that, and that I think that makes sense to everyone when it comes to Africa, is that everything is basically dependent. All the business models are basically focused and molded around the either city-specific or route-specific infrastructure that's involved.
Oh, thank you. I think that's something I've never really thought too hard about, is the cold chain. And I can imagine how important that is, especially going up into Africa. So thank you. Tim?
Yes, thank you. So I think I'd like to just sort of set the scene a little bit by explaining some of the challenges, what's really happening out there on the ground for businesses that are operating in Africa, and what are some of the logistics, what are some of the constraints, what are some of the issues we're facing, and what are we seeing at this stage? So, at this point in time, I think, the first thing that, I almost say everybody knows, but maybe everybody doesn't know. It's necessary to sort of, repeat this. But the first thing is that, the cost of moving product in Africa is extremely high. It's often 20%, easily 20% of the cost of the product, if not more. That's roughly 3 to 4 times more than in developed countries. Moving goods is very, very slow. The time frame is very long. To move something from, for example, South Africa into an East African country can take anything between 6 weeks to 2 months if we're lucky, if there aren't constraints. I'm referring to from collection, from the manufacturer to actually ending up on the floor, having been cleared through customs and the various things. moving a product between countries in Africa is extremely challenging. So we tend to think about moving product from, say, Europe or South Africa or the US into Africa. Well, that's one thing. Between countries is actually sometimes harder and slower and more expensive, which is surprising because obviously these countries are in closer proximity. The administrative requirements relating to cross-border logistics are cumbersome and very expensive and slow. The other thing is there are very few transport options in terms of modes of transport at this stage. Really, you've only got, in most cases, road freight. Sea freight's available if the country's obviously not landlocked. But when it's available, port congestion is common and a major challenge. And the availability of rails is limited. So a lot of time and energy and money is spent on just getting products moved around in Africa, and hence the sort of this is why this topic is so important that we discuss. But I think what we are seeing in these countries is that there are improvements and there is development and infrastructure that's already happening. I think there's definitely been a recognition from government that this has to be a focus area, and there's been a lot of focus in the last few years. We're seeing a lot happening with regards to road infrastructure. There's projects in the cities, flyovers, highways going around cities, etc., etc. The impact of that is almost immediate for business. As soon as there's a highway that bypasses a city, the congestion in that city is completely alleviated and it's completely tangible. The cost of moving product around the city drops, etc. So this is happening. There is some degree of legislation that's been put in place, for example, to prevent heavy commercial vehicles going into cities, and rather using the rest of the road network. And I think there's also, to be noted, a lot of rail developments. It's small in relation to what we see, what exists in South Africa, but if you take Tanzania, for example, Kenya, there's a few thousand kilometers of rail, sort of being developed, and so on. So I think what's important to realize is that these basics do need to be put in place. There's definitely a place for innovation, and there's a lot of talk around that and some fantastic ideas. But it's very important that we have those basics put in place. You have to have a basic, road sort of network and rail network, and so on. And of course, air freight has improved dramatically as well because there's been a focus on airports, improving airports and so on. So I think that's the message: is that we need to understand the basics have got to be right. The governments have got to be involved here, and then innovation, is absolutely key, in the continent. So what does all this do when you've got improved transport, improved, logistics environment? Well, immediately that's going to draw foreign direct investment. We're not going to go and invest in a country we can hardly access, or it's extremely difficult to access. It definitely plays a role in, a company deciding, are we going to go and put money in that country or not? Consumer affordability, that's one of the more obvious ones, and so on, is immediately felt when there's a proper logistics environment. Just to finish off, I think what some of the innovations that we're seeing and are coming more and more to the forefront in the region, particularly East Africa, is around electric vehicles. I think there's some interesting discussions happening. There's a lot that's already happened, and there's a lot of demand, surprisingly. I say surprisingly because a lot of people are surprised by this, particularly in the slightly more developed markets like Kenya for electric vehicles, and the infrastructure that goes with that, is key. So I think the region is very open to innovation. I think the people in these countries are aware of what's available out there, and I think it's a question of time before this this comes into our region. So that's from our side.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember reading quite a few years ago saying a thing that said that transport, and in particular the speed of transport, is the key to upliftment, because if you can move product twice as fast or twice as efficiently, it releases other resources into that environment. And that, that's clearly why you see most big cities that have been around for hundreds of years are based at transport nodes or transport hubs. And I think that's, something we shouldn't forget, that'll bring it about. But I'm pleased to hear that electric is moving. I think personally, and other than my own personal bias that I drive an electric vehicle, but I think the idea is that electric vehicles does give us a level of independence, because you are, through renewable energy, able to charge your own vehicle. You don't have to have a fuel connection. The other thing it does is I think it brings stability to the economy, because you're not exposed to these radical fluctuations that we've seen in fuel. So I think those are the underlying, maybe even subconscious drivers to some extent, where people are looking and saying, this will help me. And yes, there are going to be the more difficult. There is some more infrastructure to get in place. It is reliant on different things. But I think at the same time, it really is going to open up some of those freedoms, in terms of moving tech around. Eden, I can see you're edging to tell us something about the projects you're working with.
Thanks, Winston, and it was very interesting to hear the previous panelists, very insightful and really good work that they're working on at the moment. From our side at Uyilo, one of our key projects, which has kind of been used to spill over into other initiatives, is that at our facilities at Nelson Mandela University in Gqeberha, which is now known as Port Elizabeth, we have what we call a smart grid ecosystem. So what we do at Uyilo is we really very much involved with piloting, testing, and validation in terms of new innovative products and e-mobility solutions. Because once you've tested and validated and piloted a project, then it attracts investment, and then that goes towards commercialization. So within our facilities, we have a fleet of chargers, AC and DC chargers, which are powered by solar energy and also by energy stored in second life electric vehicle batteries, as well as the grid. So we are piloting that just to try and understand, when the rollout of electric vehicles speeds up in South Africa, how is that going to impact the grid, and how can renewable sources of energy support that? So we've actually started this year with a project in collaboration with EU via Horizon 2020, and also in collaboration with other African countries in Kenya, Morocco, and Ghana, is taking this smart grid ecosystem concept and taking it to remote areas in the Eastern Cape, where we've built where we're looking at building, starting to build an off-grid containerized system using the same concept, energy stored in second life electric vehicle batteries, and also solar energy, with no support by the utility grid, and also sourcing electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers to be used in terms of transportation, because it's a cheaper, more affordable solution for a lot of communities in South Africa, and piloting that and seeing what the challenges are, what the barriers are, and how to overcome that. And at the end of the day, validating that concept to encourage more investment. The same initiatives are also happening in the other countries that I've just mentioned. And then the aim is to gain learnings and see how we can learn from each other, and how we can overcome challenges together, and how we can work together to roll out this concept across the entire continent. And we also very much involved through the support of the Technology Innovation Agency. We've got a Kickstart Fund program where we look at supporting specifically South African SMMEs in helping them commercialize their concepts or e-mobility solutions. Two projects that we're currently working on that would support the public transport system is Golden Arrow Bus Services. We are supporting them in a detailed feasibility study of the piloting of electric buses in the city of Cape Town, as well as Go Metro for minibus taxis. But I'll leave Justin to reveal what he wants to reveal in terms of the project, but we're working with Go Metro as well. And then lastly, we've got a laboratory where we look at the validation and testing of lithium-ion cells and batteries. I think, as we all know, the lithium-ion cells and batteries form the heart of an electric vehicle. So OEMs and SMMEs can come to our facilities and validate and test their lithium-ion cells and batteries. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think there's some very exciting projects in there. Shantha, I'm sure you're going to tell us lots about three-wheel vehicles in the communities.
Yeah, so maybe, I mean, I'm going to go where Tim went and just set the big picture, because I think that's important to understand what we're trying to do. I think, you know, as Tim was saying, we have a real crisis. I call it a mobility crisis in the continent. We've got to remember that on average, there are 44 vehicles per 1,000 people in the continent. And South Africa has the lion's share of those vehicles. And what we're seeing is not just, you know, a decayed infrastructure, but many urban cities are getting flooded with secondhand vehicles. Everyone wants Ford one for $5,000. You will get one because it means you can move with independence. And we don't have choices of decent, safe public transport. We've seen examples now in cities like Tanzania. Dar es Salaam has done a great public investment in shared, you know, trying to improve speed in public transport. In Kenya, obviously, we've got a huge conversion going on in the two-wheel motorbike space and investment now in e-buses. But across the continent, I'd say this is a common problem. When we talked about the cost of moving goods, I think what we should also remember is households spend at least 20 to 30% of their incomes, rural and urban, in transport. And that eats up a huge amount of their income. And often it means also uncomfortable, unsafe, huge hours of waiting. For small-scale farmers who we've been working with, that cost is even greater, because even if you have a good harvest, the middleman in the transport costs eat up your income. So sometimes it doesn't, even if you can afford to get the transport from your rural home to a market, you're going to get your profits eaten up by that middleman. So there's a real opportunity to rethink all this. And why now? Because, well, we do have the electric vehicle revolution happening. And I started, you know, doing research. I lived in China before I came back to Africa, and obviously they have been leading this process, and transport and infrastructure is ubiquitous there, and it has had a critical impact on reducing poverty and bringing development. And it's not just the high-speed trains, it's a mix of shared planning and really investing in the planning and the thinking behind it. And I think we have such a good opportunity now. What we have to do is really leverage the technology, and then we have to adapt it for our reality. And our reality is very, very different. You know, we still don't have, 70% of the continent is still rural, and people that are moving to urban areas are moving out of desperation. So we can't cope with the rates of urbanization. So we need to really not ignore rural, which is why we've started in rural. So what we've been testing is, we took off the shelf from China, but we've been trying to take a three-wheel tricycle and adapt it and build an ecosystem to support it in rural Africa. So what does that mean? It means making sure that we have spare parts and we have local technicians that know how to fix it, how to make the vehicle itself more robust, but then also leveraging battery technology and off-grid energy. I know Tim mentioned Kenya. I mean, they have excess energy now. Ghana has excess energy. I know we in Southern Africa don't have that luxury yet, but essentially the investments are coming. So there's no reason that we can't just go to electric transport, and it has the best return on investment, because it's not just about reducing the cost of moving goods, but it's about improving access to social services. It's about kids not dropping out of school, mothers not dying in childbirth because they can't get to a health clinic. So to me, it should be an absolute priority for every government. I think one of the challenges we face currently, and we've just been working, as I said, on the EV policy in ZIM, is that this this type of infrastructure is multi-sectorial, and you often have line ministries not talking to each other. So the Ministry of Energy doesn't necessarily talk to the Ministry of Transport, and then local government sits somewhere else and everyone has their own little fiefdom. So one of the challenges on the policy front is how do we break down some of these silos and get a really ambitious vision. And I think the other thing that I see is we've got 55 countries in the continent. We don't need to all reinvent the wheel. We've got the African Free Trade Agreement, but I think in the electric transport and logistics space, we need to come up with common standards. We need to start, building markets that can be scalable rather than looking at small fractured segments. So just to conclude, I mean, we've now designed our own bespoke batteries. We have a charging system where we're running fleets of 50 tricycles with a shared business model. So stop thinking about individuals owning and look at, there's an aggregate spend in the community. People need to get to the clinic. People need to get their goods. How do we service and have a creative business model that makes it viable, but also promotes a new thinking around transport? And obviously it's not solving all of the logistics, because you can still get to the growth point and there's no bus to take your goods to town. So it's part of that bottom of the market approach. But I think often we forget that bottom and we start up above. So I'm a real believer, and we've got the proof now. We've got viability, we've got demand, we've invested in the technology. So we're at the stage where now we have ambitious plans to replicate, obviously in Zim, working with agricultural partners, but obviously we're keen to move into the region, and there's enormous demand. Every rural farmer wants a transport solution. So I'll end there.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. That's fascinating. I think I'd love to have discussions outside of this forum as well. I think it's really amazing. Justin.
Yeah, so I think we've always seen the importance of data in transportation systems and how we plan, implement, and operate in hope rather than facts normally. So I started working on BRT systems, bus systems, and rail systems where they were implemented with the World Cup. And the economists and the planners said ridership would be this much and it would pay for itself in 5 years and be expanding and profitable. And ridership was always less than half of what was projected and predicted. The fate of mega projects, right? I've realized the importance early on in my career as an engineer and planner of getting the best possible data. And we have this amazing tool called the cell phone, which produces the best possible data. So GoMetro has been built around the intersection of data, analytics, and mobility. And we've had impact in rail operations, bus operations, and minibus operations. Interestingly enough, in South Africa, 70% of all public transport is run by the little vans that run everywhere, 150,000 of them officially, probably more unofficially. And that's really a responsive, dynamic, and vibrant network that produces mobility. It's maybe not systematically balanced, ideal, does exactly what the customer needs or what the government wants, but it does work, and it keeps working regardless of the shocks that we've experienced with fuel prices, COVID, etc. It is the mass mover of Southern Africa, definitely. So what we've done as a company and pretty much forged as an innovation is building the ability to digitize this operation using mobile phones, driver apps, mapping apps, plugging in devices into the vehicle to track them, and really getting an understanding of what a minibus taxi does in the day. What time does it start operating? How does it run? Where does it park? How long is it parked for? Where does it go at night? How much do they earn? How much do they pay in fuel? Who splits the earnings? The driver, the owner, the guard? How does it work? How do you get your place in the queue? And we've been able to profile these operations in different cities as well. So we've done all of South Africa's 10 metros. We've worked with the World Bank in Gaborone and Maseru. We've done work in Kigali, DRC, Uganda. So we've really got a real understanding of the operations. And so what was interesting about this data was, or getting hold of this data, was firstly to see just how extensive the network is, when services run, why services run, and also why services don't run, and whether it's profitability or just frequency. And then we had the privilege of working on the ground in changing the operations of 3 taxi associations in Cape Town. So the city of Cape Town said, well, assuming that minibuses aren't going anywhere, what can we do if we need to live with them? So we've been trying to stamp them out as cities and replace them with bus systems, but they pop back right up and they're more resilient than we anticipate. So as government, what can we do to use this feeder system? So using telematics, using data analytics, and using a simple driver app and scheduling system, we worked with a taxi association in Mitchell's Plain, the city of Cape Town, and a whole bunch of consultants to develop an operating model for 90 taxis in Mitchell's Plain. And these 90 taxis, they would run around, they would go crazy all day, 15 hours a day, 6 days, 7 days a week. And so we could moderate them down using analytics to say, all right, what if we scheduled everybody? What if we put everyone on dedicated routes? What if drivers went from 15 hours a day to 9 hours a day and you had 2 shifts? Could we reorganize and keep the passenger happy? So passenger satisfaction went from 60% to 90% when we implemented this new system, because the routes were more regular and the taxis also left empty. So we helped the taxis leave a bit faster and emptier because we knew people were along the way, rather than just sit for half an hour until they fill up. So passengers had more frequent services. Drivers earned the same amount of money, but they worked fewer hours, and they had a day off a week, and they had consistency, so it was better employment conditions. We could park 30 taxis on the side of the road and only use 60 vehicles. So the owners would still get the same amount that they got each day, but maybe their vehicle wasn't even used that day. So they saved on mileage, or then they saved on maintenance. And we, most importantly, removed about 30% of the mileage, the dead mileage, the drivers driving around looking for one passenger, and essentially showing the drivers that when you carry less than 3 passengers, you lose money. So don't move unless you've got 3 or more. That was just a simple rule. And so there was less emissions, less fuel spend, less maintenance, less assets, the same amount of revenue, because the same amount of passengers were boarding and they were paying the same, but it was a better service. So it was such a win-win-win moment in mobility that the government was satisfied, owners were satisfied, drivers were satisfied, passengers were satisfied. And it kind of points the way that data can be actionable. It can action real change. And that's what we've been pursuing. When I'll talk about our project with the electrification in, I suppose, the next round of questions. But really the lesson here is that the 4IR thing is not up here, or not necessarily just up in the ether, but actionable data can have real change on the ground if we build systems that drive change and create win-win scenarios.
Great, sure. I think that's an absolutely amazing project. And I think we're going to see that sort of thing tracking into Africa quite extensively. So well done, Justin. It's really, really good. The next part that I want to just get into is maybe more little specific questions for each person. And that is, so Craig, to start with you, what trends have you seen across Africa? Because as a or an organization working with many, many different companies, what trends have you seen in the modernization of transport and logistics infrastructure? The one that I'm particularly concerned about, or at least interested in, would be things around data and data security. You mentioned security a little bit earlier, more on the vehicle side, if I understood correctly, but I'm looking more at the data, because as we expand and more information becomes available, Justin has just given us a good example of how they've really pulled huge amounts of data and tapped into that. How does data security and personal security or personal information play a role in this evolution as we go forward to improve and modernize the logistics infrastructure?
Yes, I mean, I think looking at that, you have to look at it from 2 aspects. I think, I really like the example, Justin gave in terms of the cost savings for, passengers. I mean, that's the whole thing about supply chain management as well as data, and how you can reduce costs by, efficient management system relying on the data. When it comes to data security, I think there's two things when we're looking forward focused. The one is in terms of the private data. And that would then obviously come with the development of your smart cars and, what kind of data that collects and how, important it is to protect that. I mean, we've seen what happens with, Tesla if they hacked, there's serious consequences. And then the other one is the infrastructure side in terms of the public infrastructure or even infrastructure that's run by SOEs or, large multinationals. I mean, if we look at the hacking of the ports, that was a serious, supply chain delay and things like that. So I think when it comes to data security, the more advanced we get in terms of our management systems, both private and public sector, either it's going to be sort of your microsystems when it comes to your private vehicles or the large systems that are actually running entire supply chain networks or ports, which is sort of a multi-access is the data protection of that. I'm not a technical expert in that, but I do know that in terms of data security from our ICT side, it's growing quite substantially when it comes to the interest and the investment that is going into that. And I think countries, developing economies have kind of had this thought that they are immune to this kind of thing. But I think what's been happening lately is shown that, it can have serious implications on us. And then also, port operations, multimodal transport, moving up in especially East Africa. Once you've got a number of entities involved, the pathways and gateways to access to data do open up, and your security is diminished, and therefore you've got to, implement, better measures to actually control that. So. Yeah,
and I think especially looking at maybe continental level standards, that we've got standards that work across the countries. So I think that's going to become a very interesting discussion as we move forward to try and, ensure that these modernization of the infrastructure doesn't get exploited in certain areas. With your experience across Africa, very much in the automotive industry, I'm very interested in understanding how the vehicle fleet is changing. In other words, how are people looking? I mean, yes, certainly electrification, I think that's the given, but more on, what types of vehicles are moving more to Africa, which areas are growing, where are you seeing that interest? I know a lot of your focus is East Africa, but if you can be a little bit more, to give us some sort of idea of where the growth in the industry is happening on the vehicle side.
Sure. Look, I mean, we're predominantly in East Africa, but I think some of the, there's very similar characteristics in the West African countries. Look, I think it's a very valid question because there are changes to fleets. I think one of the big things is the move more towards, and it's so relevant, by the way, because of what's been said by the other speakers, but the move more towards the sort of two-wheelers and the smaller vehicles. A few years ago, some markets did not have this at all. Some countries didn't have this, and today we're seeing more and more growth, in that. So I think people are conscious of the cost of fuel, but also it's a great, sort of way to, move around in a congested sort of environment and so on. So that's been quite a significant change, and in our business we've got into that. We have a two-wheeler business that's doing very well. So, that's the first thing. I think, after that, you've got an important trend, which is smaller vehicle sort of engine sizes. That's taken probably longer in Africa, and I include South Africa, to gain traction. In Europe, and America maybe sits separately to this, but in Europe, smaller engines, smaller, maybe more powerful even engines, 10, 15, 20 years ago were already taking the forefront, whereas it's taken a little longer for us, but it's now definitely starting to hit home. probably for two reasons. Number one, the cost of fuel, but also the consciousness around pollution and that kind of thing. So that's a very important change and a very important dynamic. It's not so much the big, sort of 3 liter, bucky anymore. Now it's, well, hang on, what's more efficient? What's going to do the same thing, but for cheaper and better. So that's the second change. Another change that we've seen is I mentioned it earlier, and that's electric vehicles. So at this stage, it's not all of the countries, but certainly some of the more developed African countries are looking very, very seriously at this. And, obviously it won't, long distance travel between towns on the road and etc. That's not where the electrical vehicle market is. But there's an enormous amount of, city travel, and a vehicle may not do more than 100 kilometers a day, and so an electric vehicle, especially if it's being charged overnight, whatever it is, may not even need a charge during the day. It's always important to have those charging points throughout the cities, and the governments are looking at that. The various governments are looking at that, but actually maybe that's not even as much of a requirement as one may assume, because of the shorter distances in these cities. So it's not mainstream at all. Let's we have to realize that this is still quite niche, okay, but it's a talking point, and that's important. So we're seeing the drive come from government, but also UN type organizations, other NGOs, where there's almost a global standard that gets carried through across all of their their sort of activities and businesses and so on. And it's coming into the markets, and that allows the sort of other businesses in the countries and that to be sensitive to what's sensitized to what's what's happening, what's available elsewhere. Look, the challenge for OEMs, for vehicles manufacturers, is that to bring in electric vehicles into these markets it doesn't happen overnight. They have to be adapted. They have to be, it has to be viable. There is more cost to these vehicles. There's quite a bit to it. And I think working with governments also in terms of duty structures and that is key. And to some extent it's happening. Maybe there should be more engagement. But there are some constraints, and it'll take a little bit of time from the OEM side, from the manufacturer side, to get the right vehicles into the markets. But we are seeing some, they're coming through. And of course, as everyone knows, in Africa, there's a lot of used vehicles that get imported. They're known as the grey vehicles, and electric vehicles are coming through this channel already. So they're actually, it's something that's become familiar in the market. We're already seeing fleets of taxis that are entirely electric, in Nairobi. Okay. So I think those are the main changes that we're seeing. It really is different to what it was, sort of 10 years ago. So it's a very, very valid question.
It's very exciting. Yeah, I think the only contribution I can make on that, and we obviously work very much in the charging space. So I tend to agree. Charging in the city is not. It's more of a convenience than it is a requirement. But we certainly seen a lot of requests from the EV drivers. Now, I'm not talking about the people that are exploring the industry or think this is the direction. I'm talking about the guys who own EVs. And they're asking for the chargers on the highways. They're asking for them out in the smaller towns, the smaller environments. They want to get their cars out onto the roads. And if there's no infrastructure out there, it's harder to do that. So that's where we've seen a lot of the requests coming from the inner group, from that the guys actually using the technology. And I would expect that in the long term, we're going to see very similar things in other African countries. Clearly, that's very much a South African thing right now. Edom, I want to ask you can you tell us a little bit about examples of innovation that you've seen across Africa, that emerging innovation, things that are coming out, and maybe touch on, if you can, just to some extent, how standards and certification can play a role in driving these innovations, across the continent.
Thanks very much, Winston. That's a very good question. Also, to expand on what Tim elaborated on very eloquently in terms of the two-wheelers and three-wheelers, from our side, we are seeing a lot of innovations in that sector, particularly because they're much more affordable, and we've got a very large sector of society in Africa which needs affordable and safe and reliable means of transport. So within South Africa, for example, we're seeing the likes of ZB electric scooters, which is an SMME, which has received funding to expand its electric scooter business for transporting passengers and for transporting cargo as well. We're seeing the retail giants like Woolworths, for example, looking at electrification of their fleets for efficient delivery. There's a lot of work going around in East Africa, as Tim highlighted, and in West Africa as well, with the border motorcycles, as called in East Africa. And also in West Africa, there's a startup called Kofa Technologies for the electrification of electric motorcycles. And an interesting technology that they're using is battery swapping. So once the battery's empty, then they go and swap it at battery swapping stations to get a new battery. And that kind of speeds up their delivery and transportation business, because they don't have to wait to charge their vehicle. What we're also finding is that with the pilots of these, it's actually much cheaper. I'm sure all the panelists do know that it's much cheaper to maintain an electric two-wheeler or three-wheeler than a two-wheeler which is powered by petrol or diesel. There are fewer moving parts, there isn't an engine, there's no oil change. So it's very, very, very efficient. And I think these are the types of innovations which would make transport more affordable, especially in terms of first and last mile. We definitely need the four-wheelers, we definitely need minibus taxis, we definitely need passenger cars, we definitely need electric buses, but there is that gap of first and last mile. So once the minibus taxi or the bus drops you off at the main road, you still have a couple of more kilometers to go. And micro-mobility or two or three wheelers can really assist in that, as well as what Tim elaborated on in terms of congestion. The electric scooter, for example, moves much more freely through traffic, and also in terms of impact on the environment, very much environmentally friendly. So it's very interesting to see the emergence of electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers. I think in East and West Africa, it's not a new concept, but it's very exciting to see that this concept is developing in South Africa and Southern Africa as well.
Right. Oh, thank you very much. So, Shanta, sorry. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the projects that you're involved in, and I realize these projects are really down at the grassroots level and empowering people. How is that linking into the bigger picture? And with linking up, bringing together logistic systems and overall driving that. I mean, I understand the importance of it, but I think understanding how that moves up the chain is going to be very valuable as well.
Sure. So, look, I'll admit this has been we've been piloting since 2019. Obviously, Zim is a very hard country to raise investment capital. Most of the startup money in e-mobility is in East Africa. And as been mentioned in the two-wheeler sector, and it's urban. So essentially, it's a given that you have 5 million motorbikes in East Africa in urban areas between Kampala and Kigali and Nairobi. And it's an easy business case, because all you have to do is say, well, they drive petrol and here's the cost of the driver, and voila. It's also got a more immediate carbon credit potential, because obviously more pollution now in Nairobi is caused by two-wheelers than four-wheelers. What we have been doing, so we've been a bit lonely in our journey in starting in rural, and obviously focused on trying to meet the 50% of the population that's been ignored, which is African women, who still carry too much and shouldn't, and spend hours and hours of time carrying heavy loads, and also produce 80% of the continent's food while we're there. So we started with a pilot to focus on women. using the tricycle, which as I said, is been successful in China, obviously now adapting it to an African context. We started with job creation, we started with local assembly, we've trained local technicians. We've been running a fleet of 50 in a rural community with mixed farming. So essentially the business model is that you don't assume that, well, you don't want to just cater to the people that can afford to buy. And I think this is a mindset shift we have to think of when we think of transport. You know, there's that aggregate spend of 20 to 30% in the community. So it can be viable, but you have to be a bit more creative. So we've set up a transport and logistics service where women provide services using the transport and get a commission. We have a rental model. We've also tested out with service delivery. So rural civil servants often just don't have the means to do their jobs. Rural nurses are supposed to do vaccination outreach and they can't because they don't have transport. And if you call the district office, they often don't have fuel, so they never come. So for example, our rural nurse has set up 6 mobile points in a 30-kilometre radius where she has got the best vaccination rates in the district. And, you know, she can manage to get to these spots where people can come. So we've also been proving the viability for local government to invest in fleets. And in terms of trends, I mean, what's happened there is a huge investment going on in off-grid energy in Africa. Mini grids are now, there's been donor-driven mini grid projects in East Africa. But at the same time, there's also focus on rural electrification. In Zimbabwe, we have the Rural Electrification Fund. So in most growth points in Zim, you will have electricity from the grid. It may or may not be there. So we've set up a container. We're doing battery swapping, and we rely on a combination of solar, grid and off-grid. And I think that's the way to go. I don't think we should be ignoring the grid. I think we have to make the grid financially viable without, and it's just as cost effective, to be frank with you. And then we've been using a battery swapping system. And I would say in the last 3 years, we've also seen a huge technology advances in the battery sector as all the OEMs are now busy spending billions. And what's exciting to me is that you don't just think about energy storage is what we all know is missing from the mix. You can have great solar, but if you can't store the energy, and the potential with smaller 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers is that those batteries can also be used for other types of productive use assets, which are really important. They don't just need to run. Our tricycles will go 100 kilometers now on our 5-kilowatt battery that we've designed ourselves with efficient charging, and they will have a second life, which can be used for battery storage. So I think the technology is there. How do we leverage it and adapt it and use it for the needs that we have in the continent? And having been on this journey, I'll be quite honest, my frustration is there's not enough R&D going into real field testing and on the ground field testing. Everyone wants the business model to be perfect from day one. They want bankability from day one. Well, guess what? You can't build new ecosystems without investing and taking some risks. And any multinational and OEM would never introduce anything in Europe without a big R&D budget. So I think we have to push governments, but we also have to push the private sector to think longer term and start realizing that if you're going to make this transition work, you need to start thinking about the skills. How do we get certified? Yes, the EVs are much easier because they don't have a combustible engine, but you still need mechanics. You still need people to understand batteries. You still need people to understand solar. So it's an exciting sector because there's so much potential for job creation, but I don't think we're moving fast enough. And I think, not to negate the 2-wheeler solution for the boda in Kigali or Uganda or anywhere else, but that doesn't negate urban planning. And the motorbikes came big. We went from 200,000 to 5 million because we couldn't solve our traffic problem. So let's not forget about urban planning and what Justin was saying about data and managing shared transport, because then we don't need to just, whoever can afford a motorbike, great. So I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate there, but I think we need to be smarter about how we plan our infrastructure.
Thank you very much for that. I think we're running tight on time, so I want to give Justin a chance to tell us a little bit about the electrification project, Justin, if you...
Thanks. Yeah. So obviously we had a taste of the benefits of fuel reduction in mileage reduction, but we were still running diesel fleets. They're still idling. They're still spewing NOx and SOx into the lungs of women and children at taxi ranks. So it's still not, a great solution. It's a step in the right direction. So we started asking the question, well, why isn't there an electric minibus available in the market? It's an obvious market. It's the one doing the most miles, the most regularly, the biggest offtake potentially. So what's going wrong? And the answers are pretty interesting in the journey we've had, which is firstly, the part of the world that builds electric vehicles wants to sell big buses, and a lot of batteries go into big buses, and I think there's more margins in big buses. And in the European or the Chinese context, development and progress means big buses and big transport. So when we knock on the door and we want to buy a little van that seats 13 people, it's not top of the food chain with regards to what the OEMs want to make. They want to make flashy Tesla competitors and big urban movers. So we've really struggled to source vehicles. So we've got one or two or three models out of China that we've identified that we are bringing into the country, and we're busy testing, looking at homologation, looking at build quality, looking at customer acceptance. There's a bit of a stigma when it comes to vehicles from China in the South African taxi market, because some models have not lasted as long as the warranty. So one is sourcing a great product. And I think everyone on the calls mentioned finding the right product, finding the right vehicle, finding the right platform is important. And I think we've got a long way to go in buses, trucks, minibuses, bikes. I think it's a very exciting space to look at the model choices that we need. Then we figured out, okay, we have a model. The price point is expensive, but can be moderated if we enter into a kind of battery contract separate to the vehicle. Then it competes with the diesel. Where are you going to plug it in? So we've looked at taxi ranks as the obvious choice of central management. Our data showed us that minibus taxis park 60% of the time somewhere, whether it's a holding area or the taxi rank itself, but 60% of the time during the middle of the day, they're not moving. So there's ample opportunity to charge. The range we were getting out of the fact sheets and now the field tests is between 100 and 200 kilometers a charge, which we can get in within an hour or two. So there's more than enough space and time, even with load shedding, we can get taxis charged at a taxi rank. And so now the question is, all right, but how's this going to work? And I completely agree that, I take a philosophy that you learn by doing, you don't learn by planning. I think particularly South Africa has written some amazing 5-year plans, which 12 years later have gone nowhere. So we're working with the Stellenbosch municipality. They're giving us a corner of a taxi rank that they're upgrading at Bergzicht. We've got about 600 square meters, 8 bays. And we've got the opportunity, working with the local taxi association, to come up with an ownership and management model that shares the risk between the municipality as the landowner and the facility provider, the association who runs the operation and manages the queue, the owners, drivers, and ourselves as technology providers or partners. We're working with Mixed Telematics, the University of Stellenbosch, AC/DC Dynamics, HSW, and the Center for Renewable Energy at the University of Stellenbosch. I think those, and of course, that was the original vehicle partners. Uyilo have given us a Kickstart Fund award for us to focus on the management contract and the procurement contract and the PPP. This is a very unique problem. Where does this sit in the public finance and the private finance? And it's a bit of a hybrid of all. So we've got some funding from Uyilo, thank you very much, for us to come up with a model for ownership and management. And we plan to to launch the site by the middle of next year, to have about 40 taxis operating, eventually 40, starting with 8. operating, testing in the field, testing maintenance, all of these things we don't know, we're going to learn by doing. And then being a showcase that we can basically bring any taxi association, owner, municipality, politician, whoever wants to see, can come to Bergzicht and in a little pocket see electromobility working for the masses. And we hope that
Thank you so much, Justin. I think that's a really brilliant project. So yeah, I think we've come to the end of our timing. So I think just really as a final summary, I think really leveraging information, empowering people at the bottom of the pyramid, making affordable transport, getting cheaper logistics and opening up those logistics channels, I think is really what we've got to be looking at in Africa. I'm going to stretch my time and just give everybody a 10-second statement of, just the one thing you'd like to see change, but please try and keep it 10 seconds per person. Craig, all yours.
Sure. I think when it comes to speaking a lot about electric vehicles, I think I'm quite passionate about the fact that there needs to be a lot more integration between a public sector and the private sector. I think in terms of developing countries, Africa, public sector needs to be involved. There's economic, factors involved there. And then just to mention that, when it comes to the private sector, there is a lot that can be done in terms of the OEMs, bringing cheaper models of electric vehicles, especially into this country.
Thanks, Craig.
And,
Tim?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's encouraging to see what's already happening on the ground, that it's starting to improve. That's the first thing. It's also very encouraging to listen to all of the speakers and hear what innovations are coming about, particularly through the private sector. So that's very, very interesting, I think very important. And, hearing this and knowing what we experience, I think this is it's a very positive sort of aspect. I think we see things quite positively for the future with all of this that's happening.
Totally agree. Thank you very much. Eden?
From our side, I think what's very much important is taking all this knowledge and all our expertise together as panelists and actually transferring that knowledge to the public sector, specifically government, national government, local government, intergovernmental organizations, to help increase their knowledge on the electrification of transport and mobility solutions, because that will accelerate the policy shift, to enable electrification of transport.
Thank you, Eden. Absolutely, I agree completely. Shantha?
So I just want everyone to move. I think we need a much greater sense of urgency. 2030 Paris agreements, we have enough bloody promises. Now we just need to move. And I think there's no excuse. So.
Absolutely. And finally, Justin?
African solutions will be African. We can look to Europe for inspiration and China for inspiration and North America for inspiration, but the context, the problems, the realities, the institutions, and the opportunity, I think will be built by Africans for African challenges and problems.
No, what a way to finish. I almost feel like I don't want to say anything further beyond that. I think that's exactly what it's about. And I think, as Shantha said, let's get on and get the job done. I think enough talk. We talk too many and write too many studies. I think it's time to actually get out there and change the world. So thank you everybody for being here. I think it's been a wonderful session and really appreciate the time that you've given to us.